Hello everyone, Juxtaposition here. Today's video will be entitled The Lost Weekend. Of course, I'm referring to John Lennon and May Pang. The Lost Weekend. The official dates of the Lost Weekend was an 18-month period of time where Yoko Ono, this Svengali magician from royalty, nobility class, Tokyo, Japan, cast a spell upon John Lennon, but they did agree to a separation for about a year and a half, which ran essentially from October 1973 until it abruptly came to an end sometime around 1975. And a little sketchy on the dates when John Lennon was allowed to return home, as May Pang later said in her biography. Sometime around, May Pang attempted to call John Lennon when he didn't return home to their 434 East 52nd Street apartment, which is looks out at Roosevelt Island there. And it's about 2.7 miles east of the Dakota, which is that state prison looking facility building on the west side of Central Park West and 76th Street, I believe. Anyway, what I wanted to tell you is that there was a joint dentist appointment that May Pang had with John Lennon, and it was at the dentist appointment that he told her that the relationship was over and he was going to stay with Yoko Ono at the Dakota. And that happened sometime around March 1975. So if you do the math on this, October 1973 until June 1974, they were in Los Angeles, okay? And that's 9 months. And then they spent another 9 months in Manhattan at 434 East 52nd Street. So it's kind of a split 50-50 between Hollywood, Los Angeles, Hills, Sunset Boulevard, Santa Monica, and Manhattan, New York. It's kind of a 9-month left coast, 9-month right coast. You should know that May Pang didn't exactly come from under a rock. Nobody in my stories comes from under a rock. They're all selected, they're all groomed, they're all trained, and they're all ready for action. They're all crisis actors. They either have formal training at the Actor Studio of New York City or at the Royal Academy of Art or the Royal Academy of Music or Jesuit parochial schools, Jesuit high schools, Jesuit universities. Pretty much everybody in my story. There's only a very few exceptions. Charles Miles Maddock did not receive any Jesuit or professional acting training. However, he was a crisis actor, and a damn good one. So what I wanted to tell you is that John Lennon, I'm going to quote him a couple times in my story today. When asked why he returned to Yoko Ono after seemingly having the time of his life with May Pang, who was 10 years younger than him. She was 22 and John Lennon was 32 when they had their lost weekends. And John Lennon responded to the question of why he returned to Yoko Ono as the separation didn't work out. Quote unquote. The separation didn't work out. Take that for what it's worth. Anyway, it really wasn't much of a lost weekend. Everybody knew where they were. Yoko Ono telephone called daily, sometimes persistently, multiple times a day. May Pang didn't come from under a rock. However, she did come from New York City, and she grew up in a minority neighborhood in New York, and she was Chinese, so she was a minority amongst minorities. And she got a job with, yes, Alan Klein, a Jewish man from Newark, New Jersey, who had opened a recording agency in New York City entitled acronym, CIA acronym, ABKCO Records, ABCKO Records, APCO Records. Alan Klein was an accountant. He wasn't a CPA, wasn't a certified public accountant, but he was an accountant, and he knew how to count money. And according to the Rolling Stones, he stole over $1 million of cash from them. And they told Paul McCartney about that, and they told Paul McCartney, whatever you do, don't get into business with Alan Klein. He'll rob you blind. However, Paul McCartney had his own problems. Anyway, talk about how to, divide and conquer. I think COVID is a good example of what happened to the Beatles, okay? When you throw a hand grenade down and everybody doesn't know to duck for cover or to, protect their friend, it's every man for himself. And a lot of Jewish women and Jewish lawyers are in the Beatles story. You do know I did a series of videos on the Beatles, and I don't know, 6-7 months ago, and my whole opinion about the Beatles is completely different now. They were very much, they had a lot in common with the Monkees, okay? Or the Mamas and the Papas, or the Beach Boys. Because you see people, it's not going into a garage and playing your instruments and then getting a recording contract. That is not how it works, okay? And I don't care if you can write some poetry. Charlie Manson could write poetry, okay? He just didn't get a record deal. But if Charlie Manson had got a record deal, he would have got a Sonny and Cher television show. He would have got a sitcom series. Like Reba McIntosh, she got a television show. Well, Charlie Manson could have had a TV show. You think he couldn't play on Batman or the Green Hornet as a guest appearance? Or Charlie Manson couldn't appear in an episode of Barnaby Jones or Columbo? Of course he could. And he'd be very, very good. Even though he's not a killer. He's just an ordinary, innocent, harmless fellow, 5'2.5" tall. So getting back to the Lost Weekend, May Pang was working for this Jewish accountant named Alan Klein, who was now presenting himself as an agent manager for musical acts designed to get record deals from the higher authority. RCA, Columbia Records, CBS, MGM, Sony, and today it's Amazon. Amazon is Sony. Amazon is MGM. Amazon owns the Paradise, the hotel's called the Hard Rock Cafe, and they own where the alleged Stephen Paddock shooting from the Mandalay Bay Hotel is. That's owned by Amazon. The Tropicana Hotel, which I personally know a lot about since I've stayed there, that's the hotel where, Andy Williams met Claudine Loget on the street adjacent to the concert area where allegedly we had over 1,000 rounds of semi-automatic weapons fire, which would have occurred from helicopters. It most definitely wouldn't have occurred from the Mandalay Bay Hotel. That's completely implausible. But helicopters overhead, that's plausible, especially when Nellis Air Force Base is only 11 miles away, which means it's less than 11 minutes away. All right, so May Pang was working for Alan Klein at age 19. She was assigned to Yoko Ono to be her secretary and also an assistant for John Lennon as a gopher, etc. Whilst the Yoko Ono and John Lennon were living on Bank Street in the West Village area along the Hudson River. They were not moved into the Dakota. That didn't happen until an apartment came available. And that was 1973 when the Dakota became available. The Dakota, as you may remember, is the creepy looking Gotham prison that was used to film Rosemary's Baby with Paramount Pictures and Roman Polanski as director, Robert Shapira, aka Bob Evans, as the vice president slash assistant producer, because there was a producer of Rosemary Baby and it was not Robert Evans. All I tell you is that the shooting for Rosemary's Baby, the film shooting, not the murder of John Lennon, but the film shooting of Rosemary's Baby occurred in December 1967, which explains why the Roman Polanski Sharon Tate fake wedding was planned for the next month to celebrate Rosemary's Baby, which hadn't been released yet. January 20th, 1968 is when the fake marriage of Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski occurred in London, England, in the hot zone, the only part of that story that has any verification is the cocktail party at the Playboy Club in London, which is adjacent to the Grand Sheraton Hotel, which is 200 yards from the Dorchester Hotel. That is across the street from where Cass Elliot was murdered. It's across the street where Keith Moon was murdered 4 years later in 1978. It's Dorchester Hotel is the hotel where Alan Klein signed his contract tentatively with Yoko Ono and John Lennon. That was on January 28th, 1969. Okay. And then Peter Sellers was done away with in 1978 at the Dorchester Hotel. So do you see how many historic events have happened? At the Dorchester Hotel, directly across the street, Cass Elliot, whose real name is Jewish, Ellen Naomi Cohen, was murdered with some kind of a heart attack at age 32. Okay? But previously, Alan Klein had signed his deal with the devil on January 28th, 1969. Then we had Keith Moon get done away with in 1978, and he was 32 years old also. And then we had the fake wedding for Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski 3 blocks away at the Playboy Club, which was a Friday afternoon cocktail party, 2 to 3 hour cocktail party, where only British intelligence spooks and British and American actors attended. And no parents attended that. Sharon Tate's mother and father were not there. Her sisters were not there. Because it's a work assignment. Anyway, those are 4 dastardly things that happened within 3 blocks. Okay? Basically the end of the Beatles. The Beatles never performed live, ever, when Alan Klein was their manager. Never. So you have a manager that's only managing the money. It's not managing the talent. And Let It Be and Abbey Roads were already underway when Alan Klein officially signed his contract on Monday, February 3rd, 1969. So he participated in the cash flow of Abbey Road and Let It Be, which weren't released for another year. Abbey Road was released in September 1969, and Let It Be, which had been completed, by April 1969, didn't get released until March 1971. All right, so Alan Klein was an accountant, and he knew how to count money, and that's really all he managed about the Beatles. He didn't manage their music. He didn't manage their schedules. Because they essentially had nothing to do with each other outside of the studio. After Alan Klein signed his tentative contract with John Lennon, with Yoko Ono present at the Dorchester Hotel on January 28th, 1969, that was the official dead end of the Beatles. They had reached their cul-de-sac of the end of the party. Anyway, after that was done, there are so many things that happen in rapid succession here, and I really want to focus on the Lost Weekend, but it's hard to do unless you know what happened before. And actually what happened before what I was going to tell you, because John Lennon was completely controlled by Yoko Ono, whose father was a private banker. They're Japanese, okay? And any stories that you may have heard that Yoko Ono had to go underground in a bomb shelter during the Allied bombings of Tokyo, it's complete poppycock. She grew up and attended academies near the in the nobility neighborhood of Tokyo, adjacent to the palace. Yoko Ono grew up outside the palace, and that was an off-limits zone for Allied bombing. There's no bombings that ever occurred anywhere near the palace, and the Emperor of Tokyo was never in danger, and neither was Yoko Ono. She is 7 years older than John Lennon. She appeared at Paul McCartney's door at 7 Cavendish Place over by St. Regis Park, which is a military facility, if you didn't know, where Brian Epstein was serving in the Royal Army before he was tossed out for homosexuality and impersonating an officer at Piccadilly Circus. Whereupon he had to see psychiatrists and agree to go to the Royal Academy of Art to learn how to be a better liar. So Brian Epstein actually knows the neighborhood where Paul McCartney lived, which is exactly 1 mile from the Dorchester Hotel where Peter Sellers was murdered. It's a mile from where Cass Elliot was murdered. It's 1 mile from the Playboy Club where Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski were, had a cocktail party, presenting themselves as husband and wife, dressed as Austin Powers. And this is where Keith Moon was done away with, 1 mile from Paul McCartney's home, which he purchased in 1965 but didn't move in until 1966 due to upgrades. Paul McCartney was living with Jane Asher's parents, which is about halfway between 7 Cavendish Place and the Grand Sheraton Hotel, Dorchester Hotel. They're next door to each other. It's the same location across the street from Green Park, next to Hyde Park. All right? Again, people, if you haven't been to these areas, you wouldn't know it. I've been to all these areas and stumbled into some of these things serendipitously. But then later I've looked at the maps, and some of these places I haven't been to. But I have been by the Playboy Club. I have been by the Dorchester Hotel. I've been all over Green Park. I've been over parts of Hyde Park. I've been along the Thames River. I've been near the Blackfriars Bridge, but not on it. And I've been in close proximity to where Judy Garland was murdered in June 1969. There were so many things going on in 1969 than the termination of the Beatles. We had the termination of Judy Garland, right? We had the termination of Sharon Tate, okay? I'm laughing, it's not funny. Sharon Tate is more or less the same age as was Jane Asher. Okay, no, scratch that. Jane Asher is younger. Jane Asher is 3 years younger than Sharon Tate. Paul McCartney is the same age as Sharon Tate. John Lennon is 2 years older than Sharon Tate. Yoko Ono was, 7 years older than Sharon Tate. No, she's 9 years older than Sharon Tate. 9 years older than Sharon Tate. So when Sharon Tate died, Yoko Ono was 34 years old. And John Lennon was 28 years old. So we don't know the whole true story about the Lost Weekend, but Yoko Ono ordered May Pang to have an affair with John Lennon and to set up, a household outside the Dakota, because they moved into the Dakota in 1973. And they did so because there was another actor, Robert Ryan, had died. You may know Robert Ryan. He was Jesuit educated from Chicago, Illinois. He was born in Chicago, raised Catholic. He attended Loyola Academy. He went on to star in many Hollywood films, and he died early at age 63, allegedly of cancer. And he resided in number 73, unit number 73 at the Dakota. And that's the unit that was then assigned to John Lennon and Yoko Ono after his death on July 11th, 1973. The Lennons moved from Bank Street over to the Dakota, which is across the street from Central Park, west. Now, if you've been watching my videos, you know that the concept that hiring a realtor and going out and looking at properties does not apply to people in the clandestine services. They are assigned housing. So you can bet that Robert Ryan was a clandestine soldier, and when he was retired from duty at age 63, they moved Yoko Ono, who's in the clandestine services under private banking, and John Lennon, who's under clandestine services as a social engineer, and they were moved into the Dakota. But you should know that when they signed the contract with Alan Klein, everybody sort of went their different ways. Paul McCartney, who had been living with the Asher family, moved into 7 Cavendish Way with their daughter, Jane Asher. And it's very similar to the Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner situation, where Robert Wagner was living with Natalie Wood's parents, but sleeping in Natalie Wood's bed when she was only 18 years old. And he was 9 years older than her. So it's kind of an inappropriate situation where you have an 18-year-old little girl living in a gated complex known as 7708 Woodrow Wilson Drive, and then you have a 24-year-old boy. 24? No, he was more. What was he? He was 27 years old. Robert Wagner was 27 years old, sleeping in an 18-year-old's bed with the parents in another room. It's kind of similar to the Jane Asher situation with Paul McCartney. Anyway, as far as I can tell, the Ashers aren't Jewish. However, they are definitely in the clandestine services, as is George Martin, who was the adult supervision in the room for all recording of Beatles music. Now, do I believe that the Beatles wrote all their music? Absolutely not. I do not believe that. I do not believe that Paul McCartney and John Lennon wrote all the music. I do not believe that. I think that is a complete lie, okay? It is a mendacity. There's no way they could have done that with their schedules. If you look and follow their itinerary, you realize it's not possible. Not to mention that they didn't organize the orchestras and the oboes and the French horns. That was all done through the professional apparatus that's known as the music industry, right? The Wrecking Crew in Hollywood, and you have a similar situation in London. All right, so I'm telling you, May Pang came from Alan Klein. Alan Klein works for the CIA, okay? And that means May Pang works for the CIA from age 19. And then works for Yoko Ono, who works for the clandestine services. And then she goes out to Hollywood, and they live in a couple of different places. They start out in a hotel, then they go to an apartment, then they go to another Jewish gentleman by the name of Lester Lou Adler, who started the Roxbury Theater down on Sunset Boulevard at the foot of Laurel Canyon. And near the foot of Laurel Canyon and Sunset Boulevard, near the Marymount Hotel. Then they ended up at 8818 Thrasher Avenue in the Birds in West Hollywood, East Beverly Hills. Sort of an unincorporated area. It's next to where Elvis Presley was living at the Truesdale Estates. Just above and to the east was 8818 Thrasher Avenue. Now, if you Google and have fun with the Googling of where John Lennon and May Pang resided in Los Angeles. Bear in mind, they were only in Los Angeles 9 months. They were in Santa Monica for a while, staying in a home. They were in an apartment for a while. They were in a hotel. So when we say stayed in Los Angeles, they didn't really stay anywhere very long. Perhaps they stayed 4 months at 8818 Thrasher Avenue. Then you're going to find real estate agents bragging that the home 8828 was the actual home, which is above Rising Glen Road. and it's in the birds. And what I wanted to tell you is it was 8818. It was not 8828. 8818 is contemporary, modern. It's larger, more square footage, and it's directly across the street from a surveillance house. And there is no way they're going to put John Lennon in 8828 with no surveillance, okay? There was a surveillance house directly across the street that has a driveway that lines up with their garage. And 8818 would be the ideal surveillance house for Maypang and John Lennon, okay? And that's just how it goes, people. And you should know that the Rainbow Bar and Grill and Harry Nilsson and Alice Cooper and Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees and Bernie Taupin, who's the so-called, songwriter for Elton John, they all know Lou Adler. They all know the people who own all the clubs along the Hollywood Sunset Boulevard because they're owned by the CIA. And there's only two people who are the provisional owners of all the nightclubs. There's only two. And they're both operatives. And one came from Jerusalem, Israel. All right? So I don't want to go back and retrace videos that I've done in the past, but once the contract with Alan Klein was signed, Paul McCartney married Linda Epstein. Now, you know her as Linda Evans. That's not her name. Her name is Linda Epstein. She's a Russian Jew who was born in Scarsdale, New York. Her father's name was Leopold Vale Epstein. Now, he goes by Lee Evans. And then his oldest son goes by John Evans. But his name's Epstein also. And before Linda Epstein could marry Paul McCartney had to break up with Jane Asher. And the way he did that was he had another Jewish girl, Marcy Swartz, in his bed at 7 Cavendish Way when Jane Asher returned home, allegedly by surprise. I think it was deliberate on purpose. Anyway, so Marcy Swartz, who's 1 year older than Jane Asher, in 1968 was found in bed with Paul McCartney at 7 Cavendish Place. This torpedoes the Jane Asher situation, and now Paul McCartney is free to have an open relationship with Marcy Swartz, which he does for the next 6 months in 1968. This is after they had returned from the Maharishi Transcendental Meditation. Okay? And then something happened sometime around, I don't know, August, September of 1968, where the relationship with Marcy Swartz, who's a screenwriter from New York City, who magically gets on a plane and introduces herself at Abbey Records, which she was sent there by the clandestine services to hook up with Paul McCartney, obviously. And anyway, Linda Evans then gets into a relationship with Paul McCartney, introduces Paul McCartney to her father, Leopold Vale Epstein. He signs a contract to become Paul McCartney's lawyer. This is occurring before Alan Klein enters the picture. Alan Klein is not the manager of the Beatles until February 3rd, 1969. So you see, you have a battle of Jewish reps. You have Paul McCartney's future father-in-law. He's not the father-in-law yet, but he is pretty confident that his daughter Linda has a rap on Paul McCartney. So you have Linda Epstein living with Paul McCartney. You have Linda's father, Leopold Lee Eastman, power of attorney for Paul McCartney. And it's a dueling attorney versus the accountant Jewish fellow from New Jersey, Alan Klein. And they both want to manage the Beatles. But ultimately, because Alan Klein got George Harrison and Ringo Starr, who's linked up with another Jewish girl of his own, Barbara Bach, whose real name is Goldbach. Barbara Bach's name is Goldbach. Okay, so Ringo Starr has a Jewish girlfriend, and Paul McCartney has a Jewish girlfriend, and John Lennon has a Japanese Svengali girlfriend. That's all going down when the Beatles explode with Alan Klein signing that contract. But it's a battle of Jewish representatives, isn't it? It's Leopold Vale Epstein versus Alan Klein. And Alan Klein won the battle but lost the war because it was Linda Epstein's father that won the war because his son Lee and Linda hit the jackpot with Paul McCartney when she married him, which he did that. So the marriage to Paul McCartney occurred on March 12th, 1969. Then, not to be outdone, John Lennon married Yoko Ono in Gibraltar on March 20th, 1969, which is 8 days later. They tried to get married in Paris, but they couldn't. And so it delayed. They wanted to get married immediately upon Paul McCartney's wedding, but it took them an extra 4 days to get married. So you have Paul McCartney and John Lennon get married, bang, bang. This is Yoko Ono's fourth marriage, okay? It's her fourth marriage. It's John Lennon's second marriage. It's Paul McCartney's first marriage. After the engagement to Jane Asher was torpedoed due to Marcy Swartz. It was Marcy Swartz that torpedoed that. And Linda Epstein was right there waiting in the wings. Anyway, so a few years go by, and the relationship with Yoko Ono after they moved into the Dakota, and it was right around the time that they moved into the Dakota that it was decided that, the earliest that they could have moved into that Dakota was around September 1973. And that is when the Lost Weekend began, October 1973. So I think Yoko Ono was busy doing remodeling with the Dakota apartment of Robert Ryan. And John Lennon probably didn't want to hear hammers banging. So he went out to Hollywood and moved into 8818 Thrasher Avenue with May Pang, who's 22 years old. And John Lennon is 32 years old. And Yoko Ono is 39 years old. Got it? Anyway, like I said, they had 9 months in Los Angeles, Laurel Canyon, Sunset Boulevard, Santa Monica, and supposedly, John Lennon was never happier in his whole life than he was in Los Angeles. But they did have the overhang of Alan Klein, who John Lennon ended up having to sue him, and that went on for years. And because it turned out Mick Jagger was right, the Rolling Stones were right, Keith Richards was right, Paul McCartney was right, and John Lennon had a lot of money stolen from him thanks to the accountant Alan Klein. But Alan Klein had to refund $800,000, which is, like several $1 million today. Bear in mind that the studios above, RCA and MGM and Sony, and CBS, they get 99% of all the money. So if you're really looking for who's really the criminal, it's not so much Alan Klein and it's not so much Leopold Epstein. They're actually fighting over the peanuts, okay? Because the big money is with Sony, because in the end, you'll see that Sharon Tate and Paul McCartney and John Lennon, they all worked for Sony. They all worked for Amazon. Essentially, their music content is owned by Amazon. And that's who they worked for. Sharon Tate, Paul McCartney, John Lennon, they all worked for the same people. And Sharon Tate was murdered, and John Lennon was murdered. Murdered at the Dakota on December 8th, 1980. And there were supposedly 2 doormen there. There were Jose Perdomo, which was kept out of the news for 10 years, and Jay Hastings, who was a concierge part-time doorman. And they were the ones that were in close attendance to John Lennon when he was allegedly shot 4 times by Mark Chapman from 10 feet away, which I'm having a hard time believing that those would be fatal wounds. It's shooting from too far of a distance with a .38 caliber pistol. Jose Perdomo could easily shoot John Lennon in the head, and then that fact could have been covered up because we've never seen photographs of John Lennon's body. But you should know that as soon as John Lennon got married to Yoko Ono, they had to do CIA duty. So as soon as they were married in Gibraltar, they returned to Paris, where they drove in a car to the Hilton Hotel in Amsterdam, Holland. And on March 25th, 1969, they were moved into room 702. Power to the People was released 2 days earlier. And we had the Bed In for Peace at the Hilton Hotel. That's owned by Conrad Hilton. He was married to Zsa Zsa Gabor in early 1960s. I didn't know that. Conrad Hilton. Remember Paris Hilton? Yeah. She was, the house, 8818 Thrasher Avenue, guess what? Is owned by the publicist for Paris Hilton, John Lennon, Bob Dylan. Who else? See, nothing is a surprise. Not a damn thing that's a surprise here. Bob Dylan, Paris Hilton, John Lennon. They're all represented by Elliot Mintz. Elliot Mintz, he owned several houses in the Hollywood Hills. It's alleged that he owned 8818 Thrasher Avenue. Okay, so he also owned what's called the Tree House. I don't have an address on that. Anyway, what I'm telling you is these are all provisional housing projects, and that's why Sharon Tate was murdered at the so-called Bella Drive. You should know that Ian Thorpe, doped gold Olympic champion, he resided in an Elliot Mintz house in 2006 to 2014. It wouldn't be surprised that, Dennis Hopper, Nick Adams, Ricky Nelson, John Denver, Frank Zappa have visited these places. They're all in an operation, various operations. All right, so anyway, I hope that sort of covers the Lost Weekend, which really worked out to be less than 9 months in Los Angeles, and a lot of fun for John Lennon and May Pang. It didn't end well at all, but of course, it never does. The higher you fly, the harder the landing. So I'll just leave you with my new famous words. My new famous words. While I can think, while I can walk, while I can stand, while I can talk, I'm going to produce this kind of red pill content, which is the willingness to learn unsettling, life-changing truth. That's why people come to my channel. Have a great day. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.